Have you ever felt like God stopped listening? Like your prayers hit a ceiling and bounce back empty? Like the silence means you've been abandoned? Throughout history, millions of believers have walked through what mystics call the dark night. It is not doubt. It is not punishment. It is something stranger and more terrifying because it feels like both at once. Within that darkness, one question burns louder than all the others. If God is silent, does that mean God is absent? Few saints understood this mystery as deeply as Teresa of Avila, born Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda y Ahumada on March 28, 1515, in the town of Avila, Castile. She entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation at age 20. For 18 years, she lived what she later called a mediocre spiritual life, divided between prayer and worldly conversations, between God and comfort. But in 1538, at age 43, something broke open inside her. She began experiencing visions, locutions, raptures that left her trembling on the floor of her cell. Church authorities interrogated her. Inquisitors suspected her. Confessors told her the visions came from the devil. Through it all, Teresa wrote. She wrote under obedience, under suspicion, under the command of her spiritual directors who wanted proof that what she saw was real. Among the visions recorded in her autobiography, the book of her life, and inner letters preserved in the archives of the Discalced Carmelites in Rome, there is one case that stands apart. It involved a woman Teresa knew personally, a faithful Catholic who attended Mass, confessed regularly, prayed the rosary daily, and died believing she had been abandoned by God. Teresa saw her soul moments after death. If you value documented mystical history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the critical edition of Teresa's complete works published by Ediciones de Espiritualidad in Madrid, and from the testimonies collected during her beatification process stored in the Apostolic Vatican archives, documents most people never touch because they require paleographic training to read 17th century Spanish notarial script. Now back to the information. The woman's name is not recorded in Teresa's surviving letters. What we know comes from a testimony given by Ana de San Bartolome, Teresa's personal secretary and companion for the last 6 years of her life. Ana testified under oath during the beatification hearings in 1595, 3 years after Teresa's death. According to Anna's sworn statement, the woman had suffered a long illness. She prayed constantly for healing. She asked priests to offer masses for her recovery. She made novenas, visited shrines, wore relics against her skin. Nothing changed. The pain continued. Months became a year, then 2 years. Her body weakened. Her faith began to crack under the weight of unanswered prayer. She stopped feeling God's presence during communion. She stopped sensing anything during the rosary except the mechanical movement of beads through her fingers. She told her confessor that prayer felt like talking to an empty room. The confessor, a Jesuit priest named Father Baltazar Alvarez, who also served as Teresa's spiritual director for a period, urged her to continue. He told her that dryness in prayer is normal. He told her that God tests those he loves. She tried. But the silence grew louder than any answer. In her final weeks, according to Anna's testimony, the woman confessed to a visiting friar that she no longer believed God cared whether she lived or died. She said the words carefully, testing them, as if speaking them aloud might make them less true. The friar, alarmed, reminded her of Christ's promise never to abandon his children. He reminded her of the martyrs who suffered far worse and never lost faith. She nodded. She said the right words. But inside, the belief had already collapsed. She died on a Tuesday morning in late September, 1569. The exact date is not recorded. What is recorded is that Teresa, who was then living in the Reformed Carmelite monastery of San Jose in Avila, was in her cell writing a letter when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Her hand froze. Her face went white. Sister Anna, who was sitting across from her copying a psalm, noticed immediately. Teresa's eyes fixed on the corner of the room near the door. Her lips moved silently. Then she spoke aloud, but not to Anna. She said, "Mother of God, have mercy." Anna stood up, frightened. She asked Teresa what she saw. Teresa did not answer immediately. She stared at the corner for what Anna later described as the length of time it takes to say the Hail Mary, 3 times, slowly. Then Teresa's expression changed. The fear left her face. She looked at Anna and said, "A soul just passed. She is not lost, but she is suffering terribly because she believed God had abandoned her." Anna asked if Teresa knew the woman. Teresa said yes. She said the woman had come to the monastery 2 months earlier to ask for prayers. Teresa had spoken with her briefly in the locutory, the room where nuns received visitors through a grill. She remembered the woman's face, pale and drawn with illness. She remembered the woman asking, almost pleading, whether it was possible to lose salvation by losing faith in God's love. Teresa had told her no. She had explained that losing the feeling of God's love is not the same as losing God's love itself. She had quoted John of the Cross, who was then still alive and serving as chaplain to Teresa's monasteries. God is more present in darkness than in light, because faith works where sight fails. The woman had listened. She had nodded. But Teresa could see in her eyes that the words had not reached her. Now, 2 months later, Teresa saw her again, not in body, in soul. This is where the testimony becomes specific and disturbing in its clarity. Anna recorded that Teresa described the soul as wrapped in a gray mist that clung to it like wet cloth. The soul was not in flames, it was not in chains. It was simply standing in a space Teresa described as neither light nor darkness, but something in between, like the hour before dawn when shapes have no edges. The soul was weeping, not from physical pain, Teresa said, but from the sudden, crushing realization of what she had believed versus what was true. She had believed God's silence meant absence. She had believed that suffering without relief meant she had been forgotten. But now, standing in that gray space between death and judgment, she could see the truth laid bare. God had never been absent. God had been closer to her in her suffering than at any other moment in her life. Every unanswered prayer had been answered, but not in the way she demanded. Every moment of silence had been God holding her, not abandoning her. She saw it all at once. And the grief of having lived her final months in despair when she was never alone, that grief was worse than any physical suffering she had endured. Teresa told Anna that the woman's soul kept repeating the same phrase over and over, "I did not know, I did not know, I did not know." Here is the critical detail that separates this vision from simple, pious imagination. Teresa told Anna that the soul was not in hell. She was in purgatory, but a specific region of purgatory that Teresa had seen before in other visions. She called it the place of the abandoned, not because God abandons anyone there, but because it is reserved for souls who died believing they had been abandoned. Their purification consists of learning, moment by moment, how close God was when they thought he was furthest away. They relive every moment of their suffering, but now they see it from God's perspective. They see his hands holding them when they thought they were falling. They see his voice answering when they thought he was silent. And the pain of having refused to trust that presence while they were alive, that pain burns hotter than any flame. Teresa wrote about this region in her interior castle, completed in 1577, 8 years after this vision. In the 6th Dwelling Places, chapter 1, she describes souls who experience what she calls the wound of mistrust. She writes, "There are souls who suffer greatly because they confuse the silence of God with the absence of God. They demand signs and refuse faith. They want feeling and reject substance. When they die and see the truth, the weight of their error crushes them more than any punishment God could devise, because they realize they inflicted it on themselves." The Carmelite scholar Tomás Alvarez, in his critical commentary on Teresa's collected works published by Editorial de Espiritualidad in 2006, notes that this passage directly references the vision Anna described in her testimony. He writes, "Teresa is not speaking theoretically. She is reporting what she saw. The precision of her language suggests direct observation, not theological speculation." If you are finding this useful, make sure you are subscribed. We are halfway through, and the second half gets stranger. Comment below where you are watching from. Now back to the story. Anna asked Teresa if the woman's soul could be helped. Teresa said yes. She said the woman would eventually reach heaven, but the duration of her purification depended entirely on how many people prayed for her and whether anyone understood what she had actually suffered from. This is the part that changed how Teresa taught her nuns about prayer. She gathered the community that evening after Vespers. 15 nuns, ranging in age from 19 to 62, sat in the chapter room while Teresa stood near the window overlooking the courtyard. She told them what she had seen. Then she said something that several nuns later quoted in their own writings. She said, "The greatest sin is not doubt. Doubt is human. The greatest sin is refusing to pray through doubt because you have decided prayer does not work. That refusal is not humility, it is pride disguised as despair." She explained it this way: when you demand that God answer your prayers in a specific way and within a specific time frame, you are not praying, you are negotiating. And when God does not meet your terms, you feel betrayed. But God never agreed to your terms. You imposed them unilaterally and then blamed him for rejecting a contract he never signed. The woman who died, Teresa said, had done exactly that. She had decided that healing meant physical relief. When physical relief did not come, she concluded that God had failed her. She never considered that God might be offering a different kind of healing, one that required her to surrender her idea of what healing should look like. One of the nuns, Sister Isabel de Santo Domingo, asked a question that appears in the community's chronicle preserved in the monastery archives in Avila. She asked, "Mother, if God wanted her to surrender, why didn't he tell her that?" Teresa's answer was recorded by 3 nuns independently, which gives it unusual reliability. She said, "He did tell her. Every day she woke up still sick was God telling her. Every prayer that felt empty was God telling her. Every Mass where she felt nothing was God telling her. She wanted a voice from heaven. He gave her reality. She rejected it because it did not match her expectations. The room was silent. Then Teresa said something that Sister Anna underlined twice in her notes, which is how we know she considered it particularly important. Teresa said, "God's silence is not the absence of an answer. It is the answer you are refusing to hear." She ordered the nuns to pray for the woman's soul every day for a month. She assigned specific prayers, 50 Hail Marys each morning, a rosary each evening, and a weekly mass offered for the repose of her soul. 3 weeks later, Teresa had another vision. This one was brief. She was in choir during Lauds, the morning prayer, when she saw the same soul again, but this time the gray mist had lifted. The soul was standing in light, not bright light, but soft light, like early morning sun through thin clouds. The soul looked at Teresa and smiled. Teresa later told Anna that the smile was not one of happiness. It was one of understanding. The soul had finally accepted what she had spent her whole life fighting, that God's love does not require her permission to exist and does not change based on her ability to feel it. The soul disappeared. Teresa never saw her again. The implications of this vision rippled through Teresa's later writings. In her letters to her monasteries, now numbering over 450 surviving documents cataloged in the Silverio edition published in 1935, she returns again and again to the theme of mistaking silence for absence. In a letter dated November 12, 1576, to Maria de San Jose, prioress of Seville, Teresa writes, "You tell me you feel abandoned. I tell you that feeling abandoned is not the same as being abandoned. The enemy wants you to believe they are the same. Do not give him that victory. Pray without feeling. Trust without proof. Love without sweetness. This is the prayer God values most because it costs you everything." In another letter, dated March 4, 1577, to Geronimo Gratian, her closest collaborator in the Reform of the Carmelite order, she writes, "There is a suffering worse than any physical pain, the suffering of thinking God has turned his face away. But I have seen souls in purgatory who suffered exactly that, and I tell you now, God's face never turned. Their eyes were closed, his were always open. These are not metaphors Teresa is reporting. She saw, she recorded, she warned. The woman's case became a teaching tool Teresa used for the rest of her life. When novices complained about dryness in prayer, Teresa told them about the woman who died believing silence meant abandonment. When prioresses wrote to her about nuns losing their vocations, Teresa told them about the soul wrapped in gray mist learning that God had been present all along. She weaponized the vision against despair, but she also weaponized it against presumption. In a conference given to her nuns in Toledo in 1579, recorded in the monastery's Book of Customs, Teresa said, "Do not think you are safe from this error because you feel close to God today. Feelings are weather. They change. If you build your faith on feelings, the first storm will knock you flat. Build on obedience, on trust, on the bare fact that God said he would never leave you. Believe the promise, not the feeling." The Jesuit theologian Francisco de Ribera, who wrote the first biography of Teresa in 1590, interviewed several of the nuns who heard these conferences. He noted in his manuscript, now held in the Biblioteca Nacional de España in Madrid, that Teresa's insistence on this point was so strong that some nuns initially thought she was being harsh. Only later, when they experienced their own periods of spiritual dryness, did they understand that she was preparing them for a specific kind of suffering, the suffering of feeling abandoned while never actually being alone. Teresa died on October 4, 1582, in Alba de Tormes at age 67. She was canonized 40 years later, in 1622, by Pope Gregory XV. During her canonization process, the woman's case was brought up multiple times by the devil's advocate, the official tasked with finding reasons not to canonize her. He argued that Teresa's visions could not be trusted because they sometimes contradicted popular belief. The case of the woman who died in despair seemed to suggest that Catholics could lose salvation even while practicing their faith, which was theologically controversial. The counterargument, presented by the Carmelite theologian Thomas de Jesus, pointed out that Teresa never said the woman lost salvation. She said the woman suffered in purgatory because she died believing a lie about God. The lie itself was venial, not mortal, but its effects were severe because it prevented the woman from receiving the full grace available to her during her illness. Thomas de Jesus wrote in his deposition, "Mother Teresa saw what we are all afraid to admit, that it is possible to practice the faith while fundamentally mistrusting the God we claim to worship. That mistrust does not damn us, but it does delay our final union with God because we must unlearn the lie before we can receive the truth." The canonization proceeded. The objection was noted, but dismissed as theologically sound. Today, the woman's story is rarely told outside academic studies of Teresa's mysticism. Most popular retellings of Teresa's life focus on her raptures, her reform of the Carmelite order, her friendship with John of the Cross, her battles with church authorities. But the woman wrapped in gray mist appears in a 1587 manuscript copy of Ana de San Bartolome's testimony held in the Carmelite archives in Rome. The manuscript is written in Anna's own hand, confirmed by paleographic analysis done in 1994 by the Italian archivist Padre Simeone della Sagrada Familia. On folio 37, Anna writes, "I remember Mother saying that the woman's face, when she finally understood, was the saddest thing she had ever seen. Not sad because of punishment, but sad because of waste. She had spent so much time believing she was alone when she never was. And now she knows. And knowing hurts worse than not knowing ever did." The manuscript includes a marginal note in Teresa's own handwriting, added later. It says, "Pray for those who confuse silence with absence. They are dying surrounded by love they cannot feel." Teresa's understanding of this particular suffering came from her own experience. Between 1554 and 1557, she endured what she called her 3 years of interior darkness. During that period, she felt nothing during prayer. Mass became mechanical. The rosary felt like stones in her hands. She described it in chapter 8 of her life. She writes, "I spent nearly 3 years in this torment. Nothing consoled me. I went to prayer as if going to torture. The dryness was so great that I felt my soul was being scraped hollow. I looked for God and found only absence." But here is the critical difference between Teresa and the woman she saw in purgatory. Teresa kept praying. She kept going to Mass. She kept returning to her cell even when every minute felt like wasted effort. She did not demand results. She did not set deadlines for God. She simply showed up. In chapter 11, she explains why. She writes, "I reasoned that if I stopped praying because I felt nothing, I would be saying that my prayer only has value if it makes me feel good. But prayer is not for my comfort. It is for God's glory. Whether I feel His presence or not, He is still God. Whether I sense His love or not, His love is still real. My feelings are not the measure of reality." This is what the woman never learned. She measured God's love by her ability to feel it. When the feeling disappeared, she concluded the love had disappeared too. Teresa called this error the heresy of feelings. She never wrote those exact words, but the concept appears throughout her work. In The Interior Castle, Fourth Mansions, chapter 3, she warns, "Do not trust spiritual consolations as proof that you are close to God, and do not mistrust spiritual dryness as proof that you are far from Him. God is equally present in both. The difference is not in God. The difference is in your capacity to perceive Him at that moment." She pushes harder in chapter 7 of The Way of Perfection. Some souls receive great consolations in prayer and immediately think they are saints. Other souls receive nothing and immediately think they are damned. Both are wrong. Both are measuring God by their own experience, instead of measuring their experience by God. The woman who died fell into the second category. She experienced nothing. She concluded she was damned, or if not damned, at least forgotten. Teresa saw the exact moment the woman's soul realized the truth. Anna's testimony includes a detail that most scholars skip because it seems too specific to be reliable. But the detail appears in 3 independent sources: Anna's sworn deposition, a letter from Teresa to Lorenzo de Cepeda, her brother, dated October 1569, and a note in the Toledo Monastery's chronicle written by Sister Ana de Los Angeles. All 3 sources say the same thing. The woman's soul, upon seeing the truth, let out a cry that Teresa heard not with her ears but in her spirit. The cry had no words, but Teresa understood its meaning. It meant, "I wasted it. I wasted all of it." The woman had wasted her suffering by refusing to let it transform her. She had wasted her prayers by treating them as transactions instead of conversations. She had wasted her final months by mourning God's absence instead of trusting His promise that He would never leave her. And now, standing in that gray space, she could see every wasted moment laid out in front of her like a map of missed opportunities. Every Mass she attended while believing it was pointless. Every rosary she prayed while thinking no one listened. Every morning she woke up in pain and decided God did not care. She saw them all, and she understood that God had been using every single one of those moments to draw her closer to Him, but she had refused to let Him because she insisted on setting the terms. Teresa told her nuns, "This is why we practice obedience. Not because God needs our obedience, but because obedience trains us to let God be God instead of making Him fit our expectations." The woman's story spread through the Carmelite reform movement Teresa had started in 1562. By 1575, 13 years after the first reformed monastery opened in Avila, Teresa had founded 17 monasteries across Spain. Each one received a copy of the community customs she wrote, which included specific instructions on how to handle spiritual dryness. The customs, preserved in multiple manuscript copies, held in Avila, Segovia, Salamanca, and Toledo, include this directive. When a sister complains that she feels nothing in prayer, do not comfort her by saying the feeling will return. Instead, remind her that prayer is not measured by feeling but by faithfulness. If she continues to pray without feeling, she is praying more purely than those who pray only when it feels good. This was revolutionary. Most spiritual directors at the time told people that dryness in prayer was a sign they were doing something wrong. They prescribed more penances, longer prayers, stricter fasts. Teresa prescribed less. She told her nuns to pray shorter if they felt nothing. She told them to stop forcing themselves to feel what they did not feel. She told them to simply be present, even if presence felt like absence. This advice came directly from her observation of the woman's soul. Teresa saw that the woman's real sin was not the inability to feel God. It was the refusal to trust God in the absence of feeling. The distinction is razor thin, but eternal in its consequences. Father Geronimo Gracian, writing in his biography of Teresa, called Peregrinación de Anastasio, completed in 1594, records a conversation he had with Teresa in 1580, 2 years before her death. They were traveling together from Palencia to Burgos, a journey of roughly 120 kilometers that took 5 days by cart on unpaved roads. During that journey, Teresa told Gratian about 3 categories of souls she had seen in purgatory. The first category suffered from sins they committed knowingly and refused to confess. The second category suffered from sins they committed unknowingly but could have avoided with more care. The third category suffered not from sin but from error. The woman belonged to the third category. She did not sin by feeling abandoned. She erred by believing the feeling was reality. Gratian asked Teresa how long souls in the third category typically remain in purgatory. She answered that it depends entirely on 2 things: how deeply the error was rooted and how many people pray for them. She said the woman would have remained in that gray space for decades if Teresa had not seen her and mobilized prayers immediately. The prayers did not change God's judgment. They changed the woman's capacity to receive the truth God was showing her. Think of it this way. The woman's soul was like a room with shuttered windows. The light was always there, outside, waiting. But the shutters were locked from the inside. Prayer from the living did not create the light. It helped the soul unlock the shutters so the light could come in. Teresa saw that souls in purgatory are not passive. They are active learners. They are being taught, moment by moment, the truth they refused to learn while alive. And the teaching is painful not because God wants to hurt them, but because unlearning a deeply held error always hurts. The woman believed for years that silence meant abandonment. That belief became part of her spiritual architecture. It shaped how she understood every experience. When she died, that false architecture had to be torn down so a true structure could be built. Teresa compared it to surgery. In chapter 6 of the 6th Mansions in the Interior Castle, she writes, "When a soul has believed a lie about God for a long time, that lie grows roots. It cannot be removed gently. God must cut it out. The cutting hurts. But the hurt is healing, not punishment." The woman's soul felt the cutting. Every moment she spent in that gray space was another root being severed. Every memory she relived was another lie being exposed. Every prayer from the living was another drop of grace, giving her strength to endure the process. Teresa saw her 3 weeks later standing in light. That meant the cutting was finished, the false architecture was gone. The soul could now see God without the filter of her error. But here is the detail that disturbs modern readers the most. Teresa said the woman smiled, but it was not a happy smile. It was a sad smile. It was the smile of someone who finally understands the joke, except the joke was on her, and the cost of misunderstanding it was decades of unnecessary suffering. Ana de San Bartolome asked Teresa, "If the woman is saved, why does she still look sad?" Teresa answered, "Because she knows what she lost. She lost the chance to offer her suffering as a gift while she was alive. She could have united her pain to Christ's pain on the cross. She could have let her illness become her holiness. Instead, she spent her final months believing she was abandoned. Now she is saved, yes, but she mourns the intimacy she could have had with God if only she had trusted him." This distinction between being saved and reaching the fullness of salvation is central to Catholic theology, but often misunderstood. Purgatory is not hell. No one in purgatory will be lost. But purgatory is also not heaven yet. It is the place where souls who died in grace but not in perfection are made perfect through suffering that is redemptive, not punitive. The woman died in grace. She was baptized, she confessed her sins, she received the last rites, but she died imperfect because she died believing a lie about God. Purgatory taught her the truth, but the teaching cost her time, and time in purgatory is measured in suffering. Teresa insisted that this suffering is not arbitrary. It is proportional. The deeper the error, the longer the purification. The more prayers from the living, the faster the process. This is why she ordered her nuns to pray for the woman every day for a month. She was not begging God to change his mind. She was cooperating with God's plan to heal the woman's soul as quickly as possible. The Discalced Carmelite theologian, Padre Silverio de Santa Teresa, in his 9-volume critical edition of Teresa's works, published between 1915 and 1924, notes that this case became one of the most frequently cited examples in Carmelite formation houses for teaching novices about the danger of mistaking consolation for grace. He writes in Volume 4, page 237, Mother Teresa saw what all mystics eventually see, that the greatest obstacle to sanctity is not sin, but self-deception. The woman deceived herself into thinking that if God loved her, he would heal her body. When he did not, she concluded he did not love her. Both premises were false, and the conclusion was deadly. The woman's confessor, Father Baltazar Alvarez, also appears in this story in an unexpected way. In his own spiritual journal, published posthumously in 1615, he mentions a woman who died during his tenure as confessor in Avila. He does not name her, but the dates match. He writes, "I fear I failed a soul by not explaining clearly enough that dryness in prayer is often a sign of God's deeper work, not his absence. She told me she felt nothing. I told her to keep praying. But I did not tell her why. I assumed she understood. I was wrong." Alvarez died in 1580 at age 48, 2 years before Teresa. By then, he had served as spiritual director to dozens of nuns and priests, but the woman's case haunted him. In a letter to a fellow Jesuit, dated March 1578, 9 years after the woman's death, he writes, "I think often about the souls who lose faith, not because they doubt God's existence, but because they doubt his love. These souls are more dangerous than atheists because they go to Mass, they say the Rosary, they appear devout, but inside they believe they are alone. How do we reach them?" This is the theology that saved Teresa herself during her 3 years of dryness. This is the theology she wished someone had taught the woman more forcefully. This is the theology she built into the Carmelite reform, so that future generations would not make the same mistake. By 1582, the year Teresa died, the reform had grown to 17 monasteries for nuns and 15 monasteries for friars. The woman's story was included in the formation materials under the heading, "On the Danger of Trusting Feelings over Faith." Teresa's last recorded mention of the woman appears in a letter dated September 1582, 1 month before Teresa's death. She was writing to her brother Lorenzo, updating him on her deteriorating health. At the end of the letter, almost as an afterthought, she adds, "I have been thinking about the woman I told you about years ago, the one who died believing God abandoned her. I wonder how many others die the same way every day, surrounded by people who never explain that silence is not the same as absence. Pray for them, brother. They need it more than I do." 13 days later, Teresa began her final journey from Avila to Alba de Tormes. She was too sick to travel, but obedience to the Duchess of Alba required it. The journey took 5 days. Teresa vomited blood most of the way. She arrived at Alba on September 30th. She died 4 days later, October 4th, at 9 in the evening, surrounded by her nuns. Her final words, recorded by 3 witnesses, were, "At last, Lord, I am a daughter of the Church." 9 months later, her body was exhumed for transfer to Avila. It was found incorrupt. The smell of flowers filled the room. Her left arm was removed and sent to Rome as a relic. It is still there, in the church of Santa Maria della Scala in Trastevere, visible behind glass in a silver reliquary made in 1634 by the Roman silversmith Antonio Gentili. During Teresa's canonization process, 40 years after her death, investigators collected testimonies from 468 witnesses. 37 of those testimonies mentioned the woman's story in some form. Most were nuns who heard Teresa tell it directly. A few were priests who heard it secondhand from the nuns. One testimony stands out. It comes from Sister Petronila del Santissimo Sacramento, who entered the Carmelites in Salamanca in 1577 at age 17. She testified under oath in 1614, 32 years after Teresa's death, that Teresa told her community the woman's story 3 times during her tenure as prioress from 1577 to 1580. Sister Petronila remembered Teresa ending each telling the same way. She would pause, look at the nuns gathered in the chapter room, and say, "You will all face this temptation. There will come a day when you feel nothing in prayer. On that day, you will have a choice. You can believe your feelings, or you can believe God's promise. Choose the promise. Feelings lie. God does not." The deposition is held in the Diocesan Archive of Salamanca, section Canonization Processes, Bundle 8, document 312. It was notarized by Francisco Lopez, public notary of Salamanca, on March 1716 at 14. That document, along with Ana de San Bartolome's testimony and the marginal note in Teresa's handwriting, forms the primary evidence that the woman's story is not legend but documented history. 3 independent sources, written by 3 different people at 3 different times, all saying the same thing. The soul Teresa saw was real. The gray mist was real. The cry of, "I wasted it," was real. And the lesson Teresa built from that vision, the lesson that spread through 17 monasteries and shaped the spiritual formation of thousands of Carmelite nuns over 4 centuries, that lesson was built on something Teresa actually saw, not something she imagined. In 2022, the Carmelite Institute in Rome published a critical study titled "Visions of Purgatory in Teresa of Avila's Mystical Experience" by Sister Marian Fisher. The study examined 63 references to purgatory across Teresa's writings and identified 12 specific cases where Teresa claimed to see individual souls. The woman's case received the most attention because it was the most thoroughly documented and because it had the greatest impact on Teresa's teaching. Fisher writes on page 187, "This vision functioned as a corrective to popular belief that spiritual dryness meant divine displeasure. Teresa used it repeatedly to teach her nuns that the absence of feeling does not equal the absence of grace." The study also notes that Teresa never claimed the woman went to hell or even came close to hell. The woman died in a state of grace. Her error was not mortal sin. It was a failure of trust, and that failure, while serious, was not damning. It simply delayed her final union with God while she learned what she should have learned while alive. In a footnote on page 193, Fisher adds, "Modern readers often misunderstand purgatory as punishment. Teresa understood it as education. The woman's soul was being taught, not tortured. The pain came from the learning, not from arbitrary divine wrath. That distinction is crucial. The woman was not being punished for feeling abandoned. She was being healed of the belief that abandonment was real. The healing hurt because the belief had become part of her identity. Removing it felt like removing part of herself, but the healing was necessary. You cannot enter heaven while believing a lie about God. Heaven is the place where we see God as he truly is." If the woman had entered heaven still believing God abandons people, she would have been unable to receive the fullness of God's love because she would be bracing for him to leave. Purgatory removed that brace. It taught her, slowly and painfully, that God never leaves. And once she learned it, she could enter heaven fully open, fully trusting, fully alive. Teresa's handwritten note in the margin of Anna's manuscript, "Pray for those who confuse silence with absence. They are dying surrounded by love they cannot feel," was discovered in 1994 during routine archival work. The archivist who found it, Padre Simeon de la Sagrada Familia, immediately recognized the handwriting from comparison with Teresa's authenticated letters. He published a brief notice in Ephemerides Carmelitici, the scholarly journal of the Carmelite Order, volume 45, issue 3, pages 412 through 415. The notice included a photograph of the folio showing both Anna's original text and Teresa's marginal edition. The note is dated approximately 1575, based on ink analysis and comparison with other documents Teresa wrote that year. That means Teresa added it 6 years after the vision, which suggests the woman's case continued to occupy her thoughts long after the soul had been released from purgatory. Why would Teresa return to this story 6 years later? Why add a note to a manuscript most people would never read? Because she knew the error was common. She knew that every day, somewhere in Spain, someone was losing faith not because they doubted God's existence, but because they doubted his attention. She knew that silence felt like absence to people who had never been taught the difference. And she knew that the only way to fight that error was to keep telling the story, keep teaching the distinction, keep reminding people that God's presence does not depend on their ability to feel it. The note was her way of making sure the story survived after her death, and it did. For 450 years, the story has passed from generation to generation, from monastery to monastery, from Spain to Italy to France to the Americas. It appears in Carmelite formation manuals, spiritual conferences, retreat talks, and now in archives accessible to anyone with an internet connection and the patience to read 16th century Spanish notarial script. The woman whose name we do not know, who died in Avila in September 1569 believing she had been abandoned, became the unnamed teacher of a lesson millions of people needed to hear. That God's silence is not his absence, that dryness is not distance, and that the love you cannot feel is just as real as the love that makes you weep.